Great pleasure for me to welcome our very first speaker, Dr. Silvio Cesare. So Dr. Silvio here is actually a founder and director at InfoSect, a vulnerability research company that he has set up. He works in various technical as well as leadership involvements in computer security and has been doing so the past 29 years and counting. So his talk today will focus and discuss about the challenges of starting and running a company specializing in vulnerability research. The challenges involving your building a team, the knowledge transfers, targets to pay attention to, and these will be some areas of focal point for his talk. So without further ado, let's put our hands together to welcome Dr. Silvio.
Thank you everybody for coming to Off by One. Really special thanks to Jacob and the Star Labs team for giving what will be a great conference, and I hope it's the first conference of the many to come. And like I was introduced, I'm going to talk about effectively building a vulnerability research company moderately from scratch. And so this talk is about some of those challenges, and it's really going to focus on building a team of vulnerability researchers, in fact. One sort of basic question, I suppose, that broadly across the sort of the cybersecurity industry isn't uniformly known is what exactly are we talking about when we're saying vulnerability research? Are we talking about a 2-week pen test engagement to audit some code for a customer? What is really the point of it? And in my sort of definition, and everyone's definition will be slightly different, but my definition of vulnerability research is the ability to reliably and repeatedly discover and exploit 0 days in hardware or software targets or a target. The targets have to be relevant. So when we talk about finding bugs and finding 0 days in the software, are we talking about that shopping cart that 3 people in the world use? No, we're not. When we talk about vulnerability research specifically, we're talking about targets that are ubiquitous in nature and most likely essential system software. When we talk about vulnerability research, we're talking about those types of targets or software configurations in the default configuration. So it doesn't really matter if we find bugs in some obscure part of the software that isn't enabled. It doesn't really count when we say that we're doing vulnerability research. Typically when we look at a target as well, it's going to be hardened and defended. There'll be some sort of software team defending that software, implementing mitigations and hardening, looking for previous exploits that have been used against the target and making appropriate responses as well. And really when we exploit these targets, we're looking for some sort of reasonably strong effect such as remote code execution or local prevents or whatever it might be, but has to cross a real security boundary that has a useful effect for the people writing 0 days for it. Any attack that achieves the objective, if your goal is to get an RCE, anything that achieves that objective, whether it's XSS or SQL injection, whatever it might be, is valid. In practice though, realistically, most of the bugs that you will find that have real use or real utility are going to be memory corruption bugs against native code like C or C++. That's just the nature that most system software that we use is written in those native languages. So the typical types of targets that we'd be interested in, operating system kernels and OSs in general, but kernels very particularly important. Operating system network services, that gets you sort of onto a box or remote code execution and so forth. Hypervisors are a great thing to look at. Guest host escapes, host prevents, guest prevents, all of those things are sort of useful. Browsers or sort of these one-click browser chains are very common and almost synonymous with vulnerability research in fact. And then we go on to things like instant messaging apps and 0 clicks. Mobile handsets are very much in scope for something that's useful and crosses the security boundary if you want it. And embedded devices are becoming part of this world as well. So vulnerability research against embedded devices, whether that's security cameras, NDRs, whatever it might be, have valid validity. If you're still sort of wondering, well, what type of thing, if I'm finding bugs in software, is it in the concept of usefulness for a vulnerability researcher? There's a Rhodium sort of bounty list is a good place to sort of get an idea of what targets have some sort of utility for vulnerability research. And so Zeronium, an exploit broker, probably quite dubious who they pass on these exploits to. But we can see at the very top, Android full chain with persistence, zero click. Then at the bottom we might have lock screen bypasses or crivets or whatever it might be. But this is just indicative of the type of things that really are essential system software and really what we want to focus on. Now, ultimately what tends to happen is that we all sort of start off quite broad and say, well, vulnerability research is, lots of software might be useful, but we end up generally all going towards these common targets or these common domains. In pen testing, you might be given any software or hardware target for an engagement. You don't really do that in VR, I guess. Not generally anyway. Occasionally you might get bespoke stuff, but in general you often sort of evolve to these set of standard targets and domains. Because ultimately the goal is to reliably, repeatedly and consistently develop research output. So the targets that you end up going towards, well, they need to be complex enough and sort of have enough code churn that there's a steady supply of bugs that come out of it. If you sort of build like a team to look at sudo, for example, you're not really going to maintain bugs in that software. You might opportunistically find some sort of crivets, but the code churn is quite low, the attack surface is quite small, so it's probably not going to be where you invest a team to look at. And even just userland crivets in general on Linux, we're a pretty hard target in that sense. It's probably not going to have a high code churn, high complexity, and a steady supply of bugs, but operating system kernels might be more useful. So you need support a supply of high quality bugs, and if you get a bug, you need to be able to be somewhat confident that you can exploit it. So some targets simply are not easy to exploit. If there's not much programmatic feedback, you can't sort of build your primitives, your read-write primitives, get info leaks, scan over memory in some programmatic way. It becomes really quite difficult. So most good exploits or reasonable exploits are going to have heap rooms, they're going to have leaks, corruption, and so forth. So this idea of this one-shot or blind attack, maybe for a non-interactive program like sudo or something like that, it's going to be very difficult. So programmatic feedback is desirable, so operating system kernels, hypervisors, browsers, these are the things that really enable you that when you find a good bug, you have a pretty good chance at exploiting it. Also, the targets need to be ubiquitous and have desired privileges. So again, I've sort of said this already, if you have an obscure package that needs a user to install some weird configuration or install a package, ultimately, probably not going to be that valuable. A little bit about me. I've been sort of in the hacking world for about 25 or so years, or 25 plus years really. I didn't do bug hunting and exploit development for the entire duration of my career. Certainly there have been people that have been my peers in that period of time that have stayed almost exclusively as bug hunters and exploit developers. I did sort of hobbyist bug hunting at various points in the first half of my career. And even back in 2002, I was one of the first sort of people, or individual researchers, that did sort of large-scale auditing of, say, the Linux kernel in particular. But most of that 25 years or so that I've been working in sort of IT or security, I've been working on low-level native development, reverse engineering, or program analysis. And in fact, I did a PhD and commercialised some of that PhD research using program analysis on malware defence, actually. I was also a university educator for a couple of years and still regularly run trainings, generally private trainings at InfoSect in my home of Australia. But that was sort of my first part of my career, first half of my career, and then I transitioned to full-time bug hunting and exploit development. So InfoSect is roughly about a 20-person VR company, about 22 people at the moment. Our team works on-prem, so we sort of unusual in today's sort of age of where people want either fully remote or at least a combination of remote and on-prem. We almost exclusively work on-prem on our facility, and we have a lab and so forth, and all of those types of things. It's founded by myself as the CTO and Kylie McDevitt as our CEO. And this talk is about some of the challenges and lessons learnt in building and running that 20-odd person VR company. So, I mean, this almost is going to be like how to build a startup talk, in fact. And so the founding team is how do you start a VR company? Well, you need a founding team that does that. Now, when you run a business, any business, not just a VR business, you need to have business know-how. But this talk is about the sort of the technical and engineering challenges. So we'll just ignore the business part of registering businesses, getting insurance, getting super, all that type of setup. I would say your founders need to be generalist specialists. So founders will be doing all the tasks at the beginning. They'll be setting up infrastructure, doing research, finding bugs, writing exploits, developing tooling, and so forth. And so your founding team needs to be able to put on many hats and do lots of different things to sort of build the team over time. And at InfoSect, my co-founder, Kylie, was a generalist, so she knew very broad IT security and cyber security, but she was also a specialist in infrastructure. And that's what I mean by generalist specialist. You can do everything, but you have some sort of unique skill that has value to the company, because no one wants to employ people that are just average at everything. So to build customers, all that type of thing, you need to be a specialist at something. I started sort of as a generalist, but I was also a researcher. So I was sort of the primary researcher when we started the company, and I still do lots of research today. Now, sales is actually a very important thing for startups. And in fact, most startups see the main problem of business. And when I say startups, cyber startups in general, not just VR companies here. In fact, not VR companies here. Most startups see the main problem of business as a sales problem. And they see that the more sales and the more customers you get, the bigger and faster you'll grow. So sales drives growth in most cyber startups. Now, in a vulnerability research focused company, that's not generally the main problem. You have a customer set that finds VR valuable. The main problem in a VR focused company is engineering. The more things you can develop, the more research output you have, that will drive growth. So the better you are at your job, you generally, the deeper your customer base will go, and the stronger it will be. There are lots of myths about VR. In fact, you see this all the time. And one of the common myths, even held by people, like quite senior people today, is this idea that if you're not doing VR already, then don't even start. Because the argument is, if you want to do VR today, you would have wanted it to do it 10 years ago, and it's only gotten so much harder in that 10-year period, so if you didn't do it then, and you're just maintaining your sort of your capability, I suppose, why would you think you can start now and catch up the past 10 years and the next 10 years going forward? So the idea is that it's too hard. You would be already doing it if you could, so don't even try. So that's sort of a very common myth, actually, but by people that sort of consume the outputs of vulnerability research. But people break these sort of myths all the time. You see CTF players, jumping into hard problems and solving hard problems. You see vulnerability researcher newcomers enter the field all the time. There are young people that enter vulnerability research and are very successful. And you see existing vulnerability research companies take on new targets or new complexities as the technology evolves. So, you see VR companies expand their repertoire so they can do new things. Now, my own transition, there's a big difference between hobbyist bug hunting and vulnerability research. Vulnerability research is a large, deep, and complex field. In my opinion, it's basically impossible to find bugs reliably unless you've invested a large amount of time studying your target, your real-world code, and your targets. For myself, when I started sort of 20-odd years ago, 25-odd years ago, I was always pretty good at finding bugs. But as I sort of transitioned to doing this full time, I lacked focus on finding relevant and impactful issues. So I was finding bugs that they really weren't that useful. So maybe it's good to do sort of advisories or something like that, or public blog posts. But in terms of finding relevant and impactful issues that vulnerability research produces, that was what I lacked. So over time, I sort of learnt my targets that I was looking at using domain-specific knowledge, and became better at identifying and focusing on relevant attack surfaces. So that's really one of the main transitions, is you're not just finding bugs anywhere, almost like a developer. You're focusing and targeting very specific attack surface that has a useful security boundary, and if you cross it, then that bug is going to be impactful. And as I did this more and more, I became better and faster at learning new targets and identifying target-specific bug hunting strategies. So, transitioning as a hobbyist bug hunter, most bugs are actually not that useful, like I've said. Bugs can be, if it's non-ubiquitous, if you think of just general development software, most developers write terrible code. That's just the reality of it. Most software is non-ubiquitous, so it doesn't really matter that much. Most software is not hardened, and it's not defended against, and the software bases are generally extremely buggy. So this doesn't, if you're finding bugs in random software, it doesn't really matter. I mean, you should be able to find bugs in non-hardened software pretty easily. And even large and flexible hardened code bases, so operating system kernels and so forth, have practically an unlimited number of worthless bugs. So if your scope is the entire Linux kernel, you should be able to find tons of bugs, but at that point you're basically becoming a kernel janitor. You're becoming a developer and fixing small kernel problems versus trying to find bugs that are useful as a vulnerability researcher. So it's great if you're a developer, but not great for vulnerability research. And identifying attack surface and focusing on relevant default configurations is really paramount. It doesn't matter if you're finding bugs in really non-default configurations that are only used randomly or occasionally. There's really no value whatsoever from a vulnerability research perspective. Now, we started sort of our founding team at InfoSect, Polly and myself, and we built the team over time. I would say that transitioning from a couple of people to a team is a challenge in itself, and I would say that leading by example is important. Research is hard, so I would say don't expect that you can just hire your way into having a successful VR company. You really need to sort of set an example, and the team will sort of come or gravitate towards you. Hiring is challenging for sure, and you have your common startup problems. I mean, do you hire the very senior people that cost a lot of money, or do you hire sort of new up-and-comers or juniors that probably are going to be sort of cheaper to hire, but probably don't have as much research output? So those are the types of questions that you have, that every startup has. You hire your first hires, become seniors or juniors. So it's exactly the same in vulnerability research. And I sort of do believe there is a place for juniors in vulnerability research. There's lots of stuff that's needed to support senior researchers, and tooling, engineering, all of those things are quite relevant. So I would say that if you're hiring, there is a place to hire junior people as well, and new up-and-comers, and even occasionally take on interns and so forth. So where do you hire these vulnerability researchers? So that you could hire well-known, famous vulnerability research specialists and veterans. You might see them on the internet, you might know that they're very good, they might be inclined to own as individuals, stuff like that. CTF players are good. CTF players that are very good at code and RE can sort of transition into professional vulnerability research. University graduates, we at InfoSect have sort of a collaboration with our sort of local national uni, and we've had interns come through that process. And they can be quite good, but an internship is also an opportunity to see if they're fit for this type of work. It's sort of quite an unusual area to work these days. From sort of a broad perspective, most young university people don't really know that there's a world of working with C and assembly and writing exploits and so forth. Sometimes you might get pen testers and consultants looking to change careers. It occasionally does happen. I would say it's not the usual path for most vulnerability researchers, but you do see, we have certainly in InfoSect had some pen testers change careers and work for us to find bugs and write exploits. Software developers, OS kernel or embedded developers are a good place to look. If someone's working on a kernel or hypervisor, they're probably good at finding bugs in those types of targets as well. We also have forensics people. If you think of IoT devices or embedded, typically you want to get the firmware off the device so you can start looking for bugs. Forensics people tend to be quite good at getting the data off the device and getting the firmware off the device so that we can start to turn it into a software problem. And then you might have electronics technicians and engineers. We do a lot of hardware at InfoSect, so we tend to have this as well. The hiring process can be complicated, and like every startup, how do you know that the person that you're hiring is fit for the job or it's a good culture fit and so forth? And so we've evolved this over a period of time, and now effectively we use a trial process for people entering or looking to work for us. We basically get them to come out and work with us, sit next to us for a couple of days, and then we give them a task indicative of the type of work that we do. And then we say, work on that task, and at the end of the couple of days that you're there, do a presentation to the team on what you've done. The task is not unrealistic for the time frame given, so we're not giving them ridiculously hard things. And normally the process is we take a fairly pointless 0 day from a real world target, and then we get them to run a POC to trigger that, verify that this bug is a real thing. And we say pointless here and there because it's probably some sort of bug that, you know, maybe, like for example, we say, get an info leak out of this code, but normally you need to be root to get sort of access to this part of the OS kernel. So that's sort of a pretty good, if they can do that, it's pretty indicative that they know how to write C code, read a code base and so forth. And it's a pretty good way of doing things. I think our hiring process has improved quite a lot, and we get better recruits and better hires because they know what they're getting to and we can see them how they work with the team as well. So you can also identify if there's a culture fit or a culture clash. So when you're working, sitting next to the people that you plan to work in the future, I mean, you identify pretty quickly if this recruit knows how to collaborate in a team. It also lets them know the expectations. You'll be surprised that there is a sort of a belief that people want to be vulnerability researchers, but they don't want to really read too much code. They don't want to write too much C code. It's like, well, that's the job. And it's very evident if a recruit knows basic skills around the terminal, that they can write code, use compilers, read code bases and so forth. And if they complete that task that we initially give them, we just basically, we get them to do sort of further work. So if they've got an info leak, can you turn it into sort of a KASLR bypass? Or if you've done that as well, we'll give them more bugs to sort of work up in that period of time. And so we always try to keep them busy and occupied for the days that they're working for us. Some people do these tasks really quite fast. And then other people, basically, given sort of an unlimited amount of time with where they're at this point, where they're at in their career, they're never going to complete it. So you're a VR company, and VR companies have a set of targets. The targets in VR are varied, but not unlimited. You need to aim for realistic targets if you're starting out. If you're a very small team of 2 people and you've never done iPhone stuff, and you decide that you're going to do an iMessage 0-click, probably an unrealistic target. You will almost certainly be doing targets or looking at targets dictated by what the founding team's specialties are. And likely you'll hire people early on to support those specialties. And as the company grows, you can certainly go more broad. And as the team grows, you'll have more outputs and so forth. As you grow, you'll typically start off with a relatively isolated component that you're targeting, and you'll add more components as your team improves. These components might be useful together. Maybe you can chain them together. And really, I would say that depth and specialization is the only way to be effective. If your goal is to be across as many targets as possible to some surface level, you will never achieve any success. And in fact, when you have juniors on the team, the basic goal of a junior is to get deep enough into some sort of narrow area that they can start to be effective. Because if they just go across a lot of broad things, they'll never reach the depth required to find useful bugs. As they become more senior, the break sort of this going deeper sort of slows down. And then they become more broader. So they start to see that, okay, maybe this thing that I'm working on actually is correlated to this thing over here. And then maybe you start to have multiple components. Knowledge sharing is paramount. The goal is to have a team that lifts each of its team members up. You don't really want, at least from my perspective, you don't want a team that is all entirely individual based and doesn't want to share anything that they've done or anything that they've learned or anything that they know. It really limits how fast your team as a whole can grow. And so there's lots of ways to sort of encourage team collaboration and team knowledge sharing and so forth. And probably most companies have variants of all of these types of things. There's things like internal documentation, so wikis and so forth. Internal presentations for the team is always good. We have like a monthly internal presentation or seminar, I suppose, where people doing talks what they've worked on. Having a collaborative team culture is actually a really big thing. It's harder for remote staff for sure, and that's one of the reasons that we're basically all on-prem. Having a collaborative team culture is easier, I would say, when you're face-to-face with your colleagues and your peers. And also having staff and sort of establishing that culture, having staff feel comfortable in asking and receiving help or giving information on what they've discovered. Having knowledge trapped within an individual and not having an opportunity to share that with the rest of the team ultimately limits how fast the team as a whole can grow and what they can achieve. I've sort of talked a lot about team culture. And it's sort of cliche when a company sort of says, it's all about team culture, but I would say it really is. When the company is small, so when looking at the company size of about less than 10, that's ultimately when your culture is built. And then as the company grows bigger, it gets really hard to change that culture unless you've nurtured that culture very strongly early on. And I would say, you might have challenging decisions to make early on to sort of enforce that culture, but it's something that has to be nurtured and pruned and grown correctly. If you just let it grow without any regard to what's happening, you will have certainly a terrible outcome as the team gets bigger, and I imagine it will become complete chaos. Now, VR is very different to pen testing and consulting. The culture is not the same. So when pen testers look at engagements and the customers that they're working with, they have a very different view of their customers. I would say pen testers are generally engaged to find some sort of sloppy misintegration or some sort of weakness with the person that's implemented that. That's generally a very broad brushstroke here. But I would say that VR people work against a large team of expert developers who spend their days, these developers, trying to write functional and hard-to-attack software. So you're going against a much stronger person writing code or teams writing code. And I would say that you have a greater understanding of the skill that developers have, and there's almost like a weird mutual respect. It's really, I use these software systems myself all the time. And for me to find bugs in the things that I use as well, I think that's they're very good developers, but our job ultimately is to find bugs in their software. So I can certainly respect the developers of these systems. I would say that most, generally cybersecurity people can't write very good code, but the developers that we're trying to find bugs in are very skillful. When you have a new starter in your team, you might fall into the trap of giving them some sort of open-ended problem. And for some starters, if you're a veteran VR person, having some broad, open-ended problem, just some sort of target and some desired effect, that makes sense. For people new to VR, so you've got your interns or your juniors or your mid-levels, it really can be demoralising. Since typically, if you're not guiding these sort of junior people, their output will be slow, inconsistent, maybe even non-existent, and probably weak as well. So I do prefer progressing newbies in VR, sort of juniors and interns, or juniors and mids really, from small tasks such as verifying a simple bug that we found, say by writing a small POC to verify that the bug exists, and then progressively giving harder tasks and making their work more valid. Again, you want to get their depth, to a sufficient level where they can actually start being useful versus not being useful at all if they only know surface level information. The more real and consistent output people have at the beginning of their employment, the more confidence they build. So if you give a junior or a mid busy work, they won't really build confidence from that. But if you give them work that maybe it's not a big impact, but it's real impact, and it's a real task, they'll feel much more confident. So I'm really opposed to this idea of busy work for younger people or junior levels. And broadly speaking, that confidence also extends to the team as a whole. New teams need to quickly find confidence, otherwise it can be quite unpleasant to work at a place like that, or sort of having no belief that you can do the task at hand. Confidence, I believe, is built by the founders and the rest of the team ultimately demonstrating confidence. If the founders can do it, or your colleagues can do it, it's sort of motivating. You think it's possible, you think it's reasonable, you think, well, I want to do that as well as a junior. And you can achieve sort of seemingly impossible objectives, and that really does build strong confidence. And then ultimately your team just sort of thinks, well, this is just business as usual. Our job is to find bugs in hard targets, and we do that successfully. Results do not always come quickly, so we're not finding good quality, impactful bugs every single day, but major findings must come at regular intervals. That's the goal of the job. I mean, as a vulnerability research company, you have to produce outputs. So if you do that, you'll have a tendency for your team to say, well, let's just hire, I know some people that are my peers from my ex-jobs or whatever it might be, and they try to push their new sort of peers as well into the company. So you sort of have this idea that you get referrals from existing staff to hire new people that are going to be good at the work. Now, if as a team, you're not getting findings or major findings at regular intervals, and you've gone for some extended period of time and you're just sort of arguing that, oh, it's just a hard target, there's probably no bugs there. Well, it's really untenable. You need a direction shift or a change of strategy must occur to stay on track. You have to have regular outputs. Engineering will have a role in building, in maintaining a VR company, and so you'll need to do engineering support work as well as doing pure research. Some companies that are large enough have separate engineering teams to research teams, but as a small team, even for us at InfoSect, as a 20-person company, researchers will be required to do some of the engineering work. And it's going to be motivating in a sense that engineering work tends to be fairly linear in getting progress, whereas in research seems to be a bit more lumpy. And even though it's sort of, research might be nothing, something, and nothing, something, ultimately under the hood as well, you can actually see linear progression in research as well. So even though the outputs is what you want, you can see researchers, I've audited this part of the code, I've identified attack surface, I know these APIs are problematic. All of these things are linear progressions of getting deep into the target, and ultimately you have a pretty good intuition whether your researcher that has followed this path is going to be successful. What typically indicates non-success in a researcher is that they won't have any tangible, measurable output, apart from the bug itself or the exploit itself, and if they don't know what the attack surface is, enumerate all the APIs, know the problematic things, know the architecture of the system, you can sort of see that they're not going to be successful. But engineering needs to support that as well. I mean, there's a lot of engineering work to support vulnerability research. But some researchers do prefer just research and don't want to do engineering work. Others don't mind a bit of both. I sort of, as a general specialist founder, I'll end up doing engineering work as needed as well. At some point, the focus will be to make everything as professional as possible. Coding and research output standardization occurs, so you follow standard sort of templates and standard sort of use of your code. You build systems and engineering work to automate things as much as possible, to try to take the human out of the loop when it can be done, just to have consistent output, even though the human in the loop is always going to be there. Internal design patterns and coding styles become solidified and then pushed across all the things that you're doing. Now, exploit reliability. The goal is as close to 100% reliable as possible. In reality, this is the goal, but in some cases it just can't be achieved. In general, it's not desirable to have a long runtime in your exploit. So if you have a reference count overflow that takes 4 hours to trigger and one core is pegged at 100% CPU, it's not considered practical for most people, for many people in fact. In hobbyist approaches, ROP is seen as a reasonable exploitation strategy as well. And ROP is not like a good strategy generally. Sometimes that's all you can do. So you do end up supporting these ROP chains. It's sort of considered quick and dirty to build a ROP chain in fact. But if you do that, your exploit now is version specific. You have to maintain ROP chains and the maintenance burden becomes quite significant. Infrastructure, we work on-prem, you will need infrastructure. Your network on your premises will be vastly more complex than is reasonable from a comparable sized company. You'll have enclaves and various other types of networks. And you need infrastructure people. Good infrastructure people can be somewhat challenging to hire. And the thing is, you need people that are very senior to understand your setup and requirements. But VR companies generally aren't telco grades, work on telco-sized networks internally. So the work, from an infrastructure perspective, is interesting to work in a VR company. It's not classically desirable by infrastructure people. For me, and InfoSect in general, my co-founder is a very senior infrastructure specialist, so I was able to sort of cross that bridge quite well. But for many other people, I imagine building infrastructure has its own set of complexities. And if one of your domains is embedded, for example, at InfoSect we do hardware, then your lab is going to be a significant cost as well. We have an RF shielded room, we have an X-ray machine, workstations and so forth. All of these things are quite complex to manage and complex to build. And even just moving an X-ray machine, you have to get forklift licenses. All of these things add complexity. Now, is there a technical glass ceiling? to VR. And I would say that many traditional jobs do have essentially a ceiling in terms of what you can do, in terms of career progression. It's true really regardless of what people advertise on the brochures. Certainly true in Australia. Many techs reach their top level in their area of expertise. Their salary effectively maxes out and the work they do becomes more routine. And then they struggle to decide if they want to transition to a non-technical role for more impact. So that's sort of the question, like, do you want to be an individual contributor and have sort of impact, or do you want more impact by managing a team of techs now and knowing that as a tech, your salary is going to max out and you're not going to be able to influence the company as much. So this same is true even in academic research. I've had a few years in academia. Senior professors tend to seek impact by becoming more administrative and supervisory in nature. So you see the same sort of things in that as well. In VR, these things I don't think are the case. It's simply not the case at all. The more you learn, the deeper you go, the more success you achieve. Proportionately, the higher your salary and your bonuses become. And really, it's sort of an unlimited amount of depth in knowing these targets and being successful at finding bugs in them. Is VR worth the hype? Is it a good job? I will say yes. It's certainly the best job I've ever had as a sort of in my technical career, and it's not just because I'm a founder. It is the most technically challenging career I've experienced in my odd 30 years of working. I do have an amazing team that I work with, and I do think we do certainly amazing stuff. So that sort of brings me to the end of the presentation. There's lots of things about running a company. This sort of turned into a startup talk as well. How do you sort of build a startup, have that culture, hiring people and so forth. But it's similar in a VR company as well. That's our specialisation. I've seen exploits referred to as modern day magic, and I do think it is an apt description. That's it for me. I'll take any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Silvio. Very insightful talk. Just to check, and yes, we do have a first question. I'm coming.
Thanks. Why is it that so many EEs end up getting into VR?
Are you talking about electrical engineers?
Yeah, electrical engineers, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, embedded has become more popular than it used to be, I suppose. I mean, go back 10 or 15 years ago, and embedded wasn't really a thing in society. And now IoT, embedded, even OT is so integral into the world that we live in that, that we want to look at them. And so where do you hire people that look at embedded? Well, I talked about on the slide, we might hire forensics people to do it. We might hire electronics or engineers that look at hardware. So I think these are sort of a pretty nice fit for IoT and embedded. There's probably a lot of people that just go into software as well just because they like the challenge. But from our perspective, as a hiring sort of, as we hire, we will certainly say yes to good engineers that can get firmware off devices, get us serial interfaces, JTAG and so forth. So I think that roughly answers your question.
Thank you. And our next question.
Thank you for the talk. You mentioned that it's very important to have consistent output. Do you ever see from your perspective you don't know when your researchers will be able to find something, but you have to constantly be producing output, and do you see that that time frame or the uncertainty? How do you manage that uncertainty in your case?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it can be perceived as like there's no output by a researcher except the research output itself, which is a bug or an exploit. And I really disagree strongly with that idea that research is this completely black box and that at random points you just have some spike and then it gets back to zero. I can see in our team, every day, if you're finding new attack surface, if you're auditing new code, then you should document that. And so you can start to see that they are making progress in their targets. And you sort of have a pretty good idea because of this sort of everyday documenting what is being done. You sort of have a pretty good intuition whether, it's like any day now, I'm pretty sure something's going to be found. And most of the time, it's pretty accurate. You sort of, you can predict that a good research output will come because they've done all the work up to that point. They remember that maybe they built a buzzer, they found some sort of secret attack surface that no one knows about. They found this weak API system. They found that the programmers are sloppy in all their testing of certain cases and so forth. There's abstractions that the developers don't know that we've identified. All of those things are sort of, an important part of research, but not the research output itself. It's more like an internally focused output, so that for your peers and your bosses as a researcher, versus the customers who will just prefer the research output itself. But I do think it's not as completely opaque, the idea that you will be successful in research. And you generally know when someone's not going to be successful in research, because often you'll see this idea of like, they'll just hop from idea to idea, never go deep in one area, and you say, well, actually, you're just sort of cycling on the same spot. You need to sort of stop, going and hopping to a next thing that you're looking at, and just go deeper in the thing that you're looking at. So depth is a pretty good indicator that you'll be successful as well. So the deeper you go in some subsystem, the more likely you are to have a result. If you have a researcher that like surface level looks at a subsystem, says, oh, it's actually getting really hard to follow all this now, I'll just jump to the next thing. Like, well, you're never actually going to be successful. So I think that's from my experience at least.
Thank you. Any other questions? We do have time for, okay.
I'd like to ask a question in more kind of business perspective as a setup of your company. I speculate that the companies that manufacture the target you research on should pay for your vulnerability or for your. I think that the business works in a way. So please give me any episode or cases that the company, the target company, doesn't want to pay for the vulnerability you found, but also didn't want to publish the vulnerability that you found.
I think I want to take the American Hollywood TV legal angle and say I plead the fifth. Those questions. That's a great question, but really, I'm under NDAs and agreements with all of my customers, so I can't really go too much into depth on any of that. But great question though, and certainly, the disclosure debate. If there's one thing that's persistent about the cybersecurity industry, is that every 5 years someone solves disclosure. And then also password complexity. It's just like passwords get longer every 5 years. Someone has a big rant about it, and it becomes a mainstream media issue. So I would say I don't expect the disclosure debate to be solved in my lifetime, but it will be solved periodically by random new people every 5 years. So I enjoy the rest of my career where the disclosure debate is constantly being re-examined.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for your talk. It's a good oversight of the industry from a founder's point of view. A quick question. In your experience, how easy is it to keep key talent, key researchers? Because they just hop over to another company that pays more. Is culture the only thing that keeping your guys intact, keeping your team intact?
Yeah, that's a great question. In fact, I think a lot of people have thought about this problem. And I would say, from my perspective, there's not that many offensive security companies out there, and you want basically the talent to stay in the offensive industry and not take terrible jobs that oppose that. How do you maintain staff? It's classic sort of startup things here. How do you have staff retention? Well, pay them what they're worth, give them a good culture, have people that they can talk to, and all of those things. So I wouldn't say we're particularly unique as staff retention in broader cybersecurity. It's still hard, but I would just say that it's not a terrible thing to have sort of staff move from company to company, so long as they don't take terrible jobs that oppose what we're doing.
Hi, so in your experience with interns or hires from universities, how much do you think that whatever they learned, let's say in IT or cybersecurity in the universities, how applicable is it to the actual work, or do they have to really unlearn a lot of the things that educators have been teaching them?
I've got a lot of views on interns and juniors. That one thing, for example, we've had a lot of remote people at university in some other city in our country say, I want to be an intern. You do really good work that they see, sort of thing. I'd like to be an intern. And in our experience, remote juniors or remote interns in vulnerability research a terrible idea. I mean, it's hard enough in a normal company to be a remote intern junior, but in a vulnerability research company, the turnaround time for like feedback of what they're doing and monitoring of what they're doing and having a colleague next to them say, oh, do this or do that, it's quite basically impossible. So in that perspective, about juniors and interns, I would say you can't really hire them remote. And so that means that you get them from sort of they either relocate to you or you get sort of a local university or something like that. I would say that in our university that we have in Australia, we often do, like as a company, a guest lecture to the sort of, the software security course that they have. And we basically talk about things like heap exploitation. And then we sort of say, well, if you like this type of stuff, maybe apply it as an intern to work for us. And that works out pretty well. All the sort of, the content that we do is sort of, memory corruption and stuff like that. So they have a pretty good idea. Then we go through the normal process of, talking to them, understanding where they are, and if they're good at this type of work. Another good thing about an internship is it's try before you buy, from an employer perspective. So if they do a 6-month internship or a 3-month internship and they're terrible, I mean, then they just don't become a full-time grad. That's pretty much, it also gives them the opportunity to say, actually, I don't really want to do this type of work, I want to do something else. Now, you can't really give interns or part-timers, in that sense, good work. And that's another sort of thing to manage as well, because generally you don't want to give good work to people that are sort of transient and might leave in a few months' time. And so there is that challenge. So again, these are all challenges that many other startups have, but the big challenge with VR is that remote interns are generally, that they will have a terrible experience and come across, they will see your company as not really doing anything useful for them because you can't really get the good work, it's hard to get feedback and so forth, so don't hire remote interns is my final comment.
Hi, is there an age limit to VR?
I mean, there's a lot of old school hackers that are sort of getting older now will be like, well, actually, a lot of my colleagues that were sort of, technical on tools from years ago are now managers and CISOs and all that type of stuff. I'm still a diehard. I still have my best experiences behind a keyboard, bashing away, reading code and stuff like that. So I'd say that there's definitely a drop-off as you get older for people to move into sort of the not on the tools side of things. But I mean, at our company, for example, we have a mix of people. We have a bunch of sort of sort of a younger crowd, and we have people with families and stuff like that that are all technical. So I say it's a great job for older people, but I mean, statistically, I'm pretty sure that a lot of my peers from 10 or 15 years ago aren't as much on the tools as I like to be today. There's nothing that I prefer than just reading code and writing code and stuff like that.
Any other questions? We still have about 10 minutes. If not, oh, we do. Okay.
Hi, given VR applies to anything with a markership or code, which areas do you think needs the most people to be on, and why?
So, I mean, managing, like, if you need a full chain of anything, it's pretty hard for one person to be across all that. So the more components in a chain probably has some sort of proportionality to how many team members are needed to support that. And depending on how much testing you're doing as well, you might need bigger teams as well. So I'd say more complexity, more targets, more components in a target probably is proportional to the number of staff that you have.
I'd like to exploit my MC capacity to also ask a question. So, Doctor, where do you see in vulnerability research is a skill gap or skill shortage in general, that if there are existing or aspiring VR practitioners, if they want to prepare for and address the skill gap, what would it be?
So for sure, like most people coming through university today, like writing in C isn't the language that they normally learn to do sort of computer science. But then you see like these emergent communities, like the CTF community is really good, and Pwn and RE is pretty good to to do that type of stuff. So I would say that in some parts of universities, the pipeline isn't sort of, the pipeline doesn't favour sort of native code, native languages, that type of stuff. But then you see most universities now will have CPF groups that do this type of binary exploitation. So maybe it's good, maybe it's bad. I don't know exactly how to encourage more juniors to get into the industry. But we do internships, we do guest lectures, stuff like that. So I think it's a cool industry. Hopefully other people come along that pipeline as well.
Thank you. Any last questions? Yes.
What's the most exotic target you've worked on that you can talk about?
I don't know. I mean, a good question. Maybe something to talk about afterwards, but very, very,
I think that's the end of your answer, right? Okay, got it. Okay. If not, I think we've asked Doctor quite a bit, so we want to put our hands together again to thank him for his generous sharing.